Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Dean Luke. I'm professor of economics here at IU and director of the Natural Resource Governance Program at the Ostrom Workshop. And so on behalf of IU, the workshop, and the Natural Resource Program, I want to welcome you to the third annual Ostrom Lecture on Environmental Policy to be given by Barry Rabe, who is a very distinguished professor from the University of Michigan. He's a political scientist and a distinguished one. His lecture, as you can see, The Politics of Carbon Pricing, promises to explore both the future of environmental policy and its path. And this path has strong ties to the work done here at IU by both Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom and their collaborators. Barry has a very long vita and bio, so I'll let you look online to get all the details, but he is currently the Harris Family Professor of Public Policy at the Ford School at the University of Michigan. He is also the director of the Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy, Close Up, an organization which you may be familiar with. He has various appointments at the university as well. His research typically focuses on, and more recently has focused on, climate and energy politics, and has a book from MIT Press last year called Can We Price Carbon? I'm guessing he'll answer that or try to answer it today. It was released last year. He has many professional awards and published widely. His bachelor's in history from Carthage College and an MA and PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. He is also a longtime friend and supporter of IU and has a son who did a graduate degree at SPIA. And so before we start, I just want to thank the workshop for its support and the staff, especially Allison Sturgeon and David Price, who made all the arrangements. So Professor Rabe will speak for 45 minutes, and I'll cut him off fairly close to that. And then he'll take questions for about 15 or so, and then we'll adjourn to the area in the back of the room, and there'll be a reception. There'll be more stuff, so don't go there now. There's nothing there yet, really. The lecture is going to be live streamed and will be available as a podcast. So help me welcome Professor Barry Rabe.
Thank you, Dean, and good afternoon, everyone. This is actually the first time you're making reference to our oldest son, Matthew. This is the first time I've ever been to Bloomington as a scholar rather than a parent. Bloomington always looks great, but it's very nice to be here. I must tell you, you get lots of texts with your children throughout the course of life these days. But about a month ago, I received a text from Matthew that raised the latest US News and World Report rankings in public affairs. And he said, gee, once again, you didn't crack the top 5. And let me know where Indiana came in. And so, that discussion moves forward. But it is truly great to be here and also part of this ongoing workshop. It would also be inappropriate for me not to note that it's a distinct pleasure to be here to continue your work honoring the memory of both the Ostroms. In my case, the person who I knew best of that remarkable team, Lynn Ostrom. Remarkable person, remarkable scholar. And I could go on for 45 minutes about the ways in which Lynn's work and conversations we had over the years influenced my thinking. I will only refer to what I believe was the very last conversation that I had with her, about a year and a half before her death. She came to Ann Arbor on a very cold night. Her plane was delayed. She was not feeling particularly well, and she was engaged and gracious over dinner. And as always with Lynn, we talked about a range of topics, but also relevant to the topic here. We raised the question of whether or not on an issue like climate change, which we often refer to in international terms, global warming, global climate change, it was possible to think of a credible climate mitigation policy regime that could have what Lynn called polyarchical features, more bottom-up than top-down. And with it, could it use powers of markets, whether a tax or a trading system, was that viable? We went back and forth on this and literally talked about a few of the cases that we'll be talking about, the more successful carbon pricing cases. And Lynn really pushed me and challenged me to begin to go farther and deeper and think about the larger political context. That was the last conversation that I ever had with Lynn. And I remember she made one of her classic emphatic points that you really need to do this and focus on political variables, because this is an area where economics has been the primary focal point, and we need to think about this in interdisciplinary terms. Then her drink came. She had been waiting for it a long time, and we never came back to that topic again. But I've been mindful of that conversation a lot in subsequent years, and it's really wonderful to be able to actually share that here in Bloomington with those of you who, so many of you, knew her and worked closely with her. And so think about this idea in federal systems like the United States, where power is shared. Is it possible to think about a commodity that is produced in abundance, that for most of its production is perfectly legal, engages people from many states and many legislative districts, and has a broad base of political support, and is linked to refining capacity, sales, distribution, outreach, and export markets? Is it possible that federal and state governments might use a tool like a tax or a market arrangement to elevate the price of that perfectly legal commodity and go back to that tool over and over and elevate the price to try to drive down demand? Is that politically possible and feasible in the US or anywhere else? And of course, that takes us to the issue of tobacco. And interesting to think that 35 years ago, when the debates were ranging about how, from a policy standpoint, but a political acceptability standpoint, you would drive down the rate of smoking in the United States and internationally. The prevailing political science literature on tobacco talked about iron triangles, impermeable subgovernments, and the presumption that very, very few jurisdictions, certainly if they had a substantial number of tobacco jobs. And I actually know this industry a fair amount because my dad sold cigars. And the first time I was paid professionally to do any writing, it wasn't very much money, was when he had me ghostwrite letters to legislators imploring them not to increase tobacco excise taxes, in this case in Illinois, because it might hurt my dad's job livelihood. And yet think about how tobacco has changed over the last 30 years, economically and politically in the United States. During the time period of particular interest to me, the mid-1990s through the period roughly in the middle of this decade, which is the primary focal point that I'll be talking about today. My point in introducing this chart, you can see it, involves a mixture of taxation and consumption rates. I realize this is not pure causation by any stretch. There were many forces and factors to drive down our rate of smoking in the mid-1980s at the mid-40% range, down today to the low teens. But my understanding is all the serious political economy work in tobacco suggests that the fact that federal government's federal excise tax during that period would raise by over 320%. Increases in both Republican and Democratic presidencies, and during that same 20-year period, 126 state legislative decisions would be made to increase tobacco excise taxes. Now, is tobacco fossil fuels? No. Striking that in many of the early congressional hearings on carbon pricing, tobacco was invoked by economists as a model. In writing by William Nordhaus and other scholars, tobacco was invoked as a possible parallel. But think about the transitions to fossil fuels and recognizing differences, how this would work. And yet, there has been for some time now a kind of conventional wisdom in scholarly and in policy circles that we could put a price on carbon through either a tax or an emission trading, cap and trade kind of a system. And lots of reasons have compelled us to that conclusion. Wasn't that long ago we thought we were at peak oil and we were running out of retrievable oil and gas, before terms like hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling entered the American and global energy lexicon. And the thinking was in conventional circles not that long ago that prices were going to go up anyway, and that was going to contribute to the transition. We were rather heady on the heels of upper right, the experience with ozone depletion, a remarkable confederation or convergence of political, regulatory, and market forces to lead to huge, huge changes in that arena of chemical production and release. Lower right, we had the remarkable experience of the provision of the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments to create an emission trading program for sulfur dioxide, perhaps one of the most heavily studied and aggressively promoted models for other arenas and areas and considerations. In fact, if you look at almost all of the congressional hearings on climate policy from the early 1990s through a period of about 2010, the SO2 model was invoked repeatedly, particularly by economists, as a model that was easy and readily transferable to the issue of carbon, even though in many respects that was an imperfect comparison. And then if we wanted to think about a tax, we had the Nordic cases, an arena that Professor Richards has looked at closely over the years, worked with the World Bank, the multiple ways in which the expectation was you could build on that early Nordic experiences to set carbon taxes relatively high, now nearly 30 years ago, keep those prices relatively high, and doing in essence the kinds of things economists could happen in terms of driving down emissions and minimizing negative economic impacts if you would create that. So it seemed as if some version of carbon pricing had a lot of momentum. Some called it inevitable. Also pretty staggering how many economists of the left, the center, the right have converged on this idea, including economists who get very close to presidents. I've tended to argue over the years the likelihood of a politically engaged economist to endorse carbon pricing is usually greater either before or after they hold office while they are in office. But even in the Trump administration, where one would not expect someone like Kevin Hassett to be able to say positive things on the White House lawn in a CNN interview just a couple of weeks ago about a carbon tax, still goes forward. And this list expands if you look internationally at this experience. So a lot of very, very active supporters arguing in effect. If there was some way you were going to go at the greenhouse gas issue, some version of a price was the right thing to do and the only way to go. And we also used to frame this issue with the presumption that you could build in US politics a democratic constituency around some form of a carbon price. But this is one that there could be bipartisan elements. It is interesting, even in relatively recent American political discourse, to think about how many Republican leaders, including presidential nominees, presidential aspirants and the like, have endorsed some variation or version of this idea, either nationally, arguing its case internationally, or in the event of governors like Mr. Romney and Mr. Pawlenty, but also others, Mr. Pataki, that this would be a good thing for individual states to do. And so what's happened? Well, as Christopher Dodd found in 2008 when he joined a bunch of other senators in Iowa and became the first American presidential candidate to expressly endorse a carbon tax and actually paid for advertising, or as Stéphane Dion, the only card-carrying social science PhD seeking to become a chief of state, an election about the same period of time to become Prime Minister of Canada found, actually saying as a candidate words like carbon tax, cap and trade, carbon price aren't necessarily ways, at least at that point, to advance a political career, may even hinder it. Climate change is a wicked problem. The costs are up front. If you want to be transparent about the costs of any pricing strategy, they are there for the eye to see. Benefits, what exactly are they? And how often in politics do we actually impose a short-term immediate cost that everyone can see with the promise that things as a result of that action might be better 10, 30, 50 years down the road? That's a really, really hard political sell under any circumstances. Toss in things like the recession, not just in the United States, the growing political divides and polarization, the difficulty on a range of environmental and energy issues for multiple parties to coalesce on any kind of policy. The last time we reauthorized the Clean Water Act in the US was in 1977. The last serious attempt to reauthorize the Clean Air Act, 1990. We've had every partisan combination possible of the legislative and executive branches of federal government in that time. This is hard to do in American politics, and yet it is not a uniquely American problem. And then throw in the shale revolution, not just bringing down the price, but expanding the number of states and the number of legislative districts that see a benefit to immediate pursuit of fossil fuels. And how that has evolved and how that has changed. And if one wants to begin to place or apply some kind of a carbon price, how you may have baked in oppositional constituencies to that kind of a policy, or perhaps any policy that might threaten continued production, expanded production and export of fossil fuels. And then the sensitivity of energy prices. We know what our gasoline prices are. We tend to pay attention to electricity bills. Who politically wants to look at this? And I offer this slide as a sampling from the gasoline excise tax, which has an absolutely fascinating political evolution, federal and state in the US, that almost identically parallels that of cigarette excise taxes. Starting in almost the state year, an interesting diffusion process, and also a baked-in revenue benefit for most gasoline taxes, which is highways and transportation funds. And yet for all the opportunities and ways that states might have played with gasoline taxes or reformed them during the same period of time, for environmental reasons, but also transportation concerns, we still often talk about gasoline taxes, certainly as former President Clinton found, as a really, really tough sell under the vast majority of circumstances, especially if one is talking about a price increase more than a penny or two per gallon. So climate change in general, but carbon pricing is challenging. And you know, this is survey data during the key time period in the book. There's also a difficulty creating a political constituency to do anything when a substantial subportion of that constituency doesn't think an issue is a problem. About 10% of Americans continue not to believe there is solid evidence that smoking a pack of cigarettes a day can increase your health risks. The extent to which, and this is a relatively straightforward question, do you believe there's solid evidence of warming global temperatures over a 4-decade period? We are not even at human causation yet. Suggests that if you're looking at orange bars, those are saying no solid evidence. That gold bar in the middle is unsure. So almost immediately you start with political constituencies that might peel off substantial number of people who say to do anything related to climate change is responding to a non-existing problem. And then you have the existence of alternatives. Not alternatives that my understanding the vast majority of any economists would endorse, but things like procurement mandates, regulatory provisions, performance standards, that in all likelihood are going to be much, much more costly per unit of reduction, but the costs are easier to hide and build a larger political constituency. This is a chart that I use in the book to actually chronicle American state adoption over an extended period of time in terms of what policies work and sell. And that mixture of policies, including renewable energy mandates, portfolio standards. A policy option at the state level where Professor Carley has done important, visible work nationally and impact internationally. Fuel economy standards, energy efficiency mandates, which again are the inverse to a large extent of what many of my economist colleagues would argue, or at least do in print, are those things that are politically most likely to emerge and to sell. So it's a pretty significant set of issues. It's one of the reasons why when I put the book title together, I ended it with a question mark. Can we price carbon? I'm not in the habit of putting question marks in my title, but to me, it's an open question. And a further question that I raise is robust carbon pricing possible? Or do we need to ditch this idea because of low political feasibility? Or simply do nothing about the climate issue because the other policies may be very, very inefficient. My definition of robust is it politically possible in democratic systems of government to adopt a carbon price, a carbon tax, or cap and trade? I don't think we should stop there. Traditionally, the thinking has been in broad policy circles, if you could just screw up political courage and jam a carbon tax through or a cap and trade system through a legislature, of course it will operate and self-implement because it's a market-based policy. We know the world is much, much more complicated than that. So further questions for me is if in fact there is that initial legislative or policy adoption, can you actually launch the policy and adapt it through inevitable bumps in the road, challenges, changes in technology, changes in energy pricing and availability beyond the orbit of a price? Can the policy endure? Carbon policies, like others, have usually a champion, perhaps a governor, perhaps a chief of staff to a governor, perhaps a speaker of the House. Champions come and go. In multi-party systems, partisan control of government shift. Does the policy endure or stick through inevitable shifts of election cycles? Because no one would argue that the idea of carbon pricing is to create a carbon price for a year or two and then have it be eliminated or reversed. And then does the policy, if it runs that gauntlet, perform? Does it do all the things that academic and supporters of the carbon price, does it work? Does it achieve the reductions that are being proposed? Does it not have the negative impacts on the economy that has long been argued? And my case base here is to look roughly from the period of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 through the end of 2016, but then sprinkling in a few updates. Primary cases for me, ones where I was watching closely, monitoring closely, and in some cases engaged, not necessarily in terms of advocacy, but participating in discussions on policy design from the United States and Canada, but also including examples from Europe and Asia. And what have we learned, not just from theorizing about what might work politically, but essentially 20 years of experience trying to do it in North America and around the world. What have we found? Adoption, initial passage, and even launch is a lot tougher than anyone anticipated. And I speak from a discipline, political science, that was slow to this agenda, was slow to move into these areas. And this is a policy arena where really the economics voice has been dominant, not just in terms of the sheer number of academic publications. And I think we owe a great debt to our colleagues in economics for doing that, but also direct policy advocacy. If one looks at the dozens and dozens of congressional hearings on this issue over a 20-year period of time, almost all the social science is economists laying out what would be the optimal or ideal terms, as opposed to supplementing that with engagement from political science on political feasibility and other kinds of disciplines. And I'm trying to bring a political take on all of this, for better or for worse. What we have learned is that initial passage and launch is much tougher than we thought. We can go back to the Waxman-Markey experience now, about a decade ago. We can look at the Australian experience. We can also now see our first presidential candidate who tried on 4 separate occasions to adopt a carbon price in the state of Washington, failed routinely every time, and is now basically trying to parlay that pretty substantial policy and political failure into a run for the presidency with climate change as a primary platform. This is hard to do. And I think the empirical lesson from around the world that the way to get what you want in terms of climate policy or a carbon price is for somehow progressives or whatever you call folks on the left together and win one tidal wave election and jam a carbon price through simply does not hold empirically. It's possible that there's no guarantee that any one particular partisan pattern produces this outcome. We also see in ways that largely were not anticipated that adopting, launching, and creating management systems that are credible, transparent, effective, and can adjust to inevitable shifts and changes do not happen. And in this area, I would argue in particular, the cap and trade brand applied to carbon has proven much, much more complicated to operationalize than we certainly saw in the US SO2 experience of recent decades. and requires very, very considerable skills that not all jurisdictions around the world have. The problems over a decade or more, the emissions trading scheme, as it's called in the European Union, are significant. There is some indeed reason to hope that more recent reforms have been salutary and encouraging, not just in elevating the price in the EU for allowances, but the overall systemic flow. But the continued performance issues and failures of this system over time did enormous collateral damage in the United States and other areas of the world where a trading scheme was considered and pursued. This question of durability across election cycles is something that environmental policy and energy policy I've been interested in some time. It's one that I don't think we've paid enough scholarly attention. And it is truly interesting to think about the large number of politicians, not just in the United States. And there may be more coming in Canada, one as early as next week, who rise to political power because their predecessor has had the success in introducing a carbon tax, and their top or leading issue to gain power is on day one, I take steps to reverse the act of my predecessor. We've seen this play out in just the US, the evolution or the diffusion, if you will, of cap and trade. The first places in North America to adopt, if you can see the tiny green up in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. That's the first executive action, Massachusetts, the first legislative action on cap and trade. And the thinking was, this is gonna sweep the United States and the world like hotcakes. And for a while, it did. We were having this conversation in 2010. This is classic diffusion. Horizontal across many states, including Michigan, did not include Indiana. Diffusion across the northern border, and the creation of 3 regional cap and trade zones. 10 years ago, I spent time in places like Winnipeg, Springfield, Illinois, all of which were making the argument that carbon markets, carbon pricing, cap and trade was part of the future. They were going to get in early and develop expertise and then build that as a kind of export trade or export market where they could dominate future markets. That's 2010, and look where we are today. Not eliminated, but a shrinkage back toward the coast, with the possible expansion now in the Northeast of Virginia and New Jersey. But even in this legislative session, after so many governors have endorsed the idea of engaging the US in climate, to revisit or reverse the efforts by the Trump administration to pull back regulatory actions by the previous administration, we see relatively few states using legislative mechanisms to do much of anything in terms of new legislative policy on climate, but certainly related to the pricing issue. And then finally, this issue of performance. It is possible, I have found, to go through legislative channels and adopt a carbon price, a hybrid system in Alberta, well over a decade ago. Create bureaucracies that know how to manage and adapt this, for it to function largely as was intended, but to create the price at such a low level and create so many exemptions and loopholes and create a revenue recycling plan where much of the money went actually back to the industries that were paying the fee, leading one to the question of whether or not this relatively popular policy amongst industry was actually accomplishing anything or was largely symbolic. And if there is an electoral leader who is likely to lose her political grip on power, having taken a pretty heroic step in Alberta, it is Premier of Alberta today, not Ralph Klein to the left, but Rachel Notley on the right, who laid out terms for a pretty substantial carbon tax and carbon price that was actively negotiated to bring other benefits from the federal government into her province, including accelerated promotion of pipeline development to export Alberta crude outside the province. A likelihood there that we will see in the next few weeks, a substantial reversal. And so for me, this does raise the question, quite aside from a few pictures, a few slides, is this something that is feasible, possible, or should we realistically take this off the table? And here's where I get into the squishy arena of the fact that there are some interesting cases out there, but the N is small. These tend to be quirky, idiosyncratic kinds of cases, and it's hard to generalize from a small set of cases. But the case of British Columbia, which we're talking about a bit earlier, is interesting to think about it in political terms. You have a right of center premier over a decade ago, Gordon Campbell, who for a whole bunch of reasons, including the fact that there's a climate-related crisis in British Columbia at that time because of something called a mountain pine beetle, which with small kinds of shifts in winter temperatures suddenly becomes an expansive pest, does huge visible damage to BC's iconic forests, elevates the saliency of climate change in that province, and out of nowhere, a premier announces that we are going to shock the world and we are going to do everything that my economic advisors are telling me and my reading of the economics literature is suggesting is right. We will adopt a clean, straight up carbon tax and return all of the revenue to the citizenry through small initial rebate checks, but more substantially different kinds of tax cuts. That's a tax that basically went from nothing to $30 a ton. The party on the left that opposed it initially has embraced it and is now taking that from $30 to $50 a ton. Is it a perfect tax? Of course not. This is public policy. Perfect does not exist, in my view. But pretty darn good in terms of the models, the impacts on reduction, and the relative consequences, and yet not a whole lot of additional cases that have flown from or built from it. Those states painted in green in the Northeast, that map, is RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is small, but there are many, many reasons why I wish Lynn Ostrom could walk through the door, but I would love to have this conversation with her. I never did. How do you explain the fact that a number of Northeastern states, despite the fact that you've had big partisan shifts in a number of these states, you've had huge challenges and disruptions to energy markets and the price of gas and all the rest in the Northeast, have somehow held together over a 10-year period of time with a relatively modest cap and trade system focused just on the electricity sector, but that has sort of run the gauntlet, was launched, has endured, underwent some wrenching shifts that were beyond the planning capacity of the architects of this, and has found a politically workable revenue source through their allocation process, which is a rough approximation, if you will, of a carbon tax. And that is to give the money that's produced in each state back to that state to make its own decisions. In some cases, as in Maryland, some of the money is returned to citizens through their electricity bills, but in others, this creates a kind of fund, almost a trust fund, where monies are allocated for energy transition and other kinds of uses, especially for small businesses and homeowners. And it again runs the gauntlet. And I also found in my journeys that there were other kinds of ways to do this. And please don't think that what I'm trying to say here is wink, wink. Here are the easy alternatives. But we do have some interesting experimentation in North America, but around the world, with actually moving upstream to the production process and putting a tax at the point of extraction. The historically interesting case here is Norway. If we want to make the case that a transition from coal to natural gas is viable and does achieve substantial environmental gains, certainly from a climate perspective, much of that is predicated on the assumption that the methane numbers that are being released alongside that oil and gas production are as close to zero as possible. Norway banned flaring in 1971 in its offshore oil operations, drove down methane rates, and it's one of the few countries in the world, including many states actually in the US, where you can find good, clear data over time on methane releases. In 1991, they complemented that with a very clear application of their carbon tax expressly to offshore oil production and other arenas, which means if you're producing methane and venting it or flaring it, that's being covered by the tax. After that tax went in, the methane numbers went down again to a very, very low level. And so I do think, especially when we look at American states, including many very conservative political states that would not be supportive in all likelihood of a carbon tax, at least as measured by their willingness to go into federal court when the Obama administration tried to create the Clean Power Plan. These are often states that sustain relatively high rates of taxation of extraction, with interesting questions then about whether those might be applied to flaring or venting. I think this upstream, downstream thing is often a topic of pure carbon pricing insiders and junkies, but there's also interesting political considerations where you apply a price and then how you share that revenue. And even things like fees and royalty payments are interesting to study and think about in this regard. Texas, of course, has been a remarkable player in wind energy production, but it's involved multiple kinds of government engagements, beginning with a portfolio standard and a regulatory requirement, but then a huge challenge that Texas was facing because it has a hard time exporting electricity outside of Texas because of the unique configuration of the North American grid. It's a long conversation for another time. But to get all that wind power in the Panhandle in West Texas across vast sections of Texas territory would require substantial transmission. Who was going to pay for it? Texas is a state that allows substantial approval of fees through elected regulatory commissions. And through fees that were placed on electricity bills primarily applied to fossil fuels, Texas raised nearly $9 billion to completely transform and update its grid and transmission system. And the royalty provisions that are an interesting consideration both for private landholders in Texas, but two large public trust funds that were created when Texas came into the Union, royalty payments that are either funding the state university system or K through 12 education, and have a very interesting application and measure of methane considerations, especially the former of those two. So there are other ways at least to begin to think about this kind of issue, even before we get into questions of fossil fuel subsidies and other forces and considerations. But this is small N territory. These are cases from which it is indeed hard to generalize and build, much less test, solid and robust theories. And so it leaves me with all kinds of questions, but one that you're probably having is, are there any design features that are common across these cases? And I wish I could give you a simple 3, 5, 7-point plan. I don't have that. There are certain forces and factors and features and elements that are significant. Happy to elaborate on any of those in Q&A, but it includes broad coalition building. It includes serious attention to the management, the oversight, the disclosure of information, the transparency of bureaucracies. But I think a key force and factor and figure is, if you're going to impose a price, then how do you begin to mitigate some of that political pain with the way in which you spend that money? Now, these are reasonable considerations, especially if your question is economic impacts and the best way to design a carbon price for economic circumstances, but then weigh that against a political calculus. And that may differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But as I argue in the book, whenever we have historically in the US launched a new kind of tax regime, or often led actually with recognizing what the benefit is, there is this inevitable question of how one is going to pay for it. The Social Security tax, the payroll tax, was not a political inevitability. It went through a brutal vetting process in the early years of the New Deal. One of the great challenges that President Dwight Eisenhower faced, this is a picture 100 years old of Ike having come back from World War I and being told he needed to take a caravan of military vehicles from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, many of which did not make the trip. It was a trip in which there were injuries, there were deaths, and Eisenhower, always with a short fuse, blew his top and thought this was barbaric. And then he went to World War II and saw and used the German Autobahn system. Ike was not the first or the only person who thought we really should, post-World War II, create an interstate highway system, whatever its climate consequences may be decades later. The real challenge at issue in that case was, if you're going to create the benefit, how on earth do you pay for it? And there were battles amongst Democrats, amongst legislators, amongst Eisenhower advisors. Do you use tolls? Do you use bonds? Do you use gimmicks? Eisenhower actually, from what we know, knew enough about the history of the state gasoline excise tax and some early federal experimentation to finally try to break the consensus. And it is fascinating to me to this day to go back to read that legislation from the 1950s. The Waxman Markey cap and trade bill that passed the House of Representatives narrowly was 1,427 pages. The entire interstate highway legislation, including the tax, including the benefit distribution process, was less than 40 pages. It is very clear. You see the tax, but you also see the allocation process and anticipate the benefit. Now that's tough to do. As some of you know, for 10 years, I've collaborated with Christopher Borak from Muhlenberg College on national surveys on energy and environment. It's where some of the earlier data came on public opinion, on belief in the existence of climate change or severity perceptions. One thing we have done is look routinely at different policy tools and instruments. And no surprise, I won't bother showing you all of the slides and all of the data. We find that carbon pricing is the least popular policy as opposed to all of the other ones that I mentioned earlier. Mandates, regulations, other kinds of things routinely poll better amongst Democrats, independents, and Republicans. But there is this interesting question. If you just focus on the cap and trade piece, we've asked for some time support for what I think is a pretty clearly defined carbon tax, and we use the C word of carbon and we use the T word of tax. We usually have a split response. And so from the late fall of 2018, the most recent data that I have, 48% of Americans say they would favor a carbon tax, 46% against, the rest uncertain. But look at how those numbers move around. And this is relatively unusual for survey research. And this is not the only time we found this when you look at possible linkages. However we run this experiment, including other ways we've tried to do this, including state-specific and work that we do outside the United States. In the public imagination, if you could link a carbon tax or a carbon price to kind of next generation energy, call it support for renewables, support for energy efficiency, next generation R&D, what have you, the numbers go up substantially across different partisan groups into the low to mid 70s. And that's been true for a number of years now. We tried to take one out of the Eisenhower playbook in the last fall survey, the Highway Trust Fund, in part because a couple of Republicans, most notably former Representative Carlos Curbelo, who lost his bid for re-election, proposed a carbon tax linked to replacement of the gasoline tax and adding extra funding into the Highway Trust Fund. You can see those numbers. And then we tried the dividend question. Usually before, when we've polled on the issue of tax cuts or the British Columbia strategy, they fall a bit behind energy-linked issues, but tend to score in the high 60s to low 70s. The dividend number, which has had a lot of broad and diverse political support, bumps the carbon price up, but not all that much. And then finally, we wanted to ask what would happen, and this is under active discussion in a number of bills before Congress. If you impose the tax or impose the price and link that toward a regulatory freeze, constraining the ability of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to impose other kinds of carbon-related regulations, we saw a hemorrhaging of Democratic support. In fact, you won't see it on the survey data, but the only thing that you can do to even further drive down public support for a carbon tax that we have seen over the years is to put the money into deficit reduction. It is the true loser. None of this is easy. None of this is consistent across jurisdictions. This has all the limits of a survey research model, but I do think in all of the cases that I have found, including some of the earlier historic ones, when you impose the price, there needs to be, if you want to increase the likelihood of this working over time, clear consensus, delineation, support for a particular kind of strategy, and then an ability to stay the course with that message over time. That is really, really hard to do. Last slide, and then I truly am happy to turn things over to questions. I also realize that most of my field work and my closest engagement has been in North America, but also the European Union. And certainly there is engagement on this issue elsewhere in the world. We have seen smatterings of interest in Asia, including the possibility that China in the coming years may launch its own version of cap and trade. We have seen in South America, countries like Chile, Colombia, and others adopt some form of a carbon tax. Carbon tax is under active consideration in places like Sierra Leone, recently adopted in South Africa. And yet, as I survey much of this work, what we are seeing there is, yes, there is some willingness to adopt, but in many cases, the prices are set very low. Many of them have lots of exemptions and opt-out clauses and other mechanisms. And so the idea that carbon pricing is really sweeping the globe amid American intransigence is not necessarily an active portrayal. And I think with it does come one other challenge and recognition, and that is just how messy this policy area is likely to be going forward. If that survey on public response to repeal or constraints on the ability to impose regulatory strategies, they raise lots of concerns in terms of the economics, but politically work. Does that mean that going forward in any credible, politically credible carbon regime, we're looking at some mixture of policies and the need for kind of complementarity? That regulation, clumsy though it is, works alongside a carbon pricing mechanism of some sort, limited though it may be. Or do we essentially do nothing and hope the problem isn't as serious as we thought? Or that we should really shift and turn to adaptation? My point here is not that carbon pricing is impossible, but if we really are serious about this tool, this is truly an all hands on deck, all disciplines on deck, and I do think that one cannot ignore the political forces and factors. You know, wouldn't it be ironic if a policy idea that emerged in democratic systems of government was only feasible politically and administratively in governments like China, for which we increasingly use the term neo-authoritarian? It's much too soon to know, but interesting to think about those patterns and themes and issues going forward. I want to thank you again for your attention. And with your permission, Dean, I think we should open up for questions.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's save Plaza come for sure, and I'll let Barry take questions. I'm glad you ended with China because I know I and many others were going to ask about China. I'll let you field the questions.